Good day, class. Welcome to today's lesson. Today we continue looking at the pillars of sustainable development. However, today's lesson we focus specifically on physical stability. So we begin as usual by defining what do we mean by physical stability. So the word stability is defined as stable, strong, or firm. So, in other words, having little to no weakness, little to no fragility. So, we're talking about stability, strength, firmness. All right. So, how does this relate to our environment? So, when we apply the term stability to our environment, we apply it in terms of water, air, and soil. So let us look at each one of these in turn briefly to see how we can, if we can understand the application of the term stability in the context of air, water, and soil. So let us look firstly at soil stability. What does this really mean? So when we talk about soil stability, we are talking about the capacity of the land to limit the redistribution and loss of soil by natural processes of wind and water erosion, etc. Right? So we know that soil can be moved um, by natural processes, but we also know soil can be moved as a result of anthropogenic activities. All right. So unstable soils, which can be a soil can be categorized as unstable due to its natural characteristics, such as, you know, a soil that's predominantly, let's say, clay, for example. We know clay soil can become waterlogged, so therefore it is naturally unstable, and as a result, it can remove vegetation by that means. However, again, we also know that soils can become unstable as well based on human activities such as deforestation, etc. All right, so instability of the soil can be both natural and unnatural. And as a result, with the removal of vegetation, we know that the soil now becomes unstable and usually now requires some kind of extra support, such as the implementation or application of engineering strategies, such as retaining walls, the use of terracing techniques, uh, the application of reforestation programs, etc. So here we see that when we talk about soil instability, we're talking about the not only the characteristics of this natural characteristics of the soil, but has the soil been affected by any other activity that now puts it at risk to soil erosion and mass movement. Okay. Then we also have water stability. Now, when we talk about water stability, we are referring to the quality of the water, which makes it suitable for a particular use, such as drinking or agriculture or any other type of use. So what are the characteristics or the quality of the water? So the water quality varies based on the particular need. So we know that the quality of water for the quality or characteristics of water that are required for it to be suitable for drinking would be different from that of agriculture. All right, so it has to be applied in each context. And what do we measure? What do we look at to determine the quality of water? We look at the physical characteristics of the water, the chemical characteristics, and the biological characteristics. Okay, so we know that water can be assessed in all of those categories. And of course, we know also that there are international standards that would be available against which we would measure these characteristics to make a determination as to what is suitable for particular uses. And then finally, we have air stability. So air stability can refer to the characteristics of the air in terms of the atmospheric processes, which would result often in unexpected meteorological phenomena. But also, we also look at um, non, we look at unrelated issues of the quality of the air in terms of the chemical and particulate constituents of the air. So when we look at the air, we look at the characteristics, as it says, chemical and particulate characteristics or constituents of the air, what pollutants can be evident in the air, all right? But we also look at how air stability can be affected in terms of how it can affect the heating and cooling of the air, which will often affect results, as mentioned here, in unexpected meteorological phenomena. For example, where we have climate change and global warming, we often expect to see increased severity of certain weather conditions like hurricanes, um, increased occurrences of hurricanes, increased intensity of hurricanes. Then we have some parts of the world severe winters, other parts severe droughts. So all of these things would be different aspects that we would look at when we are trying to define or characterize the stability of our air. So understanding these aspects of the air, water, and soil stability, which we characterize that as a group in terms of physical stability. This is necessary for understanding for planners and environmental managers because it is critical for the decision-making process. That understanding and that information is necessary for them to make wise decisions on our behalf. So managers must make use of relevant information to make informed decisions about their environment. So we would have discussed previously in one of the earlier lessons, as well as in other courses, the significance and the importance of monitoring and data collection of different aspects of our environment, because it is this data and information that provides an understanding for the decision makers in order to make wise decisions. And in cases where it's necessary for new policies and laws to be put in place, these are the people who would lobby our lawmakers and government officials to try to get things done at the highest level in order to inform wise interventions in the environmental management process, right? So additionally, the planners and environmental managers, they need to ensure that development continues in a holistic way, in other words, sustainable way that incorporates all the pillars of all the pillars of sustainable development. Because as we very well know and understand, it is impossible for us to exist on the earth without having some kind of interaction and some kind of impact on our environment. So how can we do this in a wise and sustainable way? A lot of information is environmental information and understanding is critical to that decision-making process. So with regards to soil stability, let's look briefly at sustainable agriculture. So soil stability is important because it affects our food security. So we put in this into context now in terms of how it can affect us. So it affects our food security, which is in turn necessary for good health, which is in turn necessary for national productivity and economic growth. All right. So it's important that we understand the connection between the conditions of our soils and our overall health and development as a nation. So when we talk about soil stability with regards to sustainable agriculture, some of the indicators that would be of interest to us would be how much available land space is available for agriculture, and in particular sustainable agriculture. Because remember, we're talking about food security. So in other words, what is your capacity, what is a nation's capacity to be able to produce food to sustain itself? You also have to look at this suitability of the topography. Is a landscape appropriate for certain types of food production? Remember, some parts of the world, including some parts of the Caribbean, often volcanic islands that often affect the topography of the island. Is very hilly. So then you have to consider what type of production would be, of food production would be appropriate in those kinds of conditions. Then you also look at, have to consider, is there adequate distribution of soil? Not every soil type is appropriate to agricultural production, and not every soil type can accommodate certain types of agricultural production. So you have to look at the distribution of that across your available land space. Also, you have to look at the climatic conditions. What type of climatic conditions do you have available to you? And is it appropriate to certain types of food production? And again, all of this leads right back to a nation's food security and its ability to produce food to feed itself. So how do we define sustainable agriculture? So sustainable agriculture is a type of agriculture that focuses on producing long-term crops and livestock while having minimal effects on the environment. So the concept here should be familiar already, right? So this type of agriculture tries to find a balance between the need for food production and the preservation of our ecological system within the environment. So that balance between our need for food and the activities involved in our food production, and trying to find that balance to ensure that we do not negatively disrupt and affect our natural environment. Because in the long term, we are going to need that natural environment in order to extract resources from it. So how do we do that wisely? So in addition to producing food, there are several overall goals associated with sustainable agriculture that involves the conservation of water. So agriculture, we know, requires vast amount of water to facilitate production. How can we do that in a responsible manner while conserving our water supplies? Typically, agriculture would also involves the heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides, which we know can pollute our water sources. So how can we conduct sustainable agriculture in such a way where we can reduce the amount or the volumes of fertilizers and pesticides, as well as reducing the pollution of our water? In addition to which, how can we conduct agricultural practices while promoting biodiversity in our crops, as well as maintaining good, healthy biodiversity levels in our ecosystem? Because remember, when we talked about ecological stability, that was one of the indicators that we looked at, right? What are your levels of biodiversity? Whenever you see those levels begin to drop, it means that you have an indication that there is a gradual and systematic collapse that of your ecosystem that is about to come. So our goal here with sustainable agriculture is to try to promote biodiversity, okay? And in many cases as well, when we talk about the biodiversity in terms of our agricultural practices, we also find as well that that helps as well. If you practice things like intercropping, it also helps to reduce the amount of pests as well as the amount of fertilizers that you need, as it does not deplete your soils, for example, overly deplete your soils of specific types of nutrients if you have intercropping taking place. And additionally, sustainable agriculture must also focus on maintaining the economic stability of the farms. So they need to be productive in terms of being able to bring in an income so that the farmers can continue to carry out their practices, right? So they need to be able to bring in that income to improve their quality of life while at the same time maintaining the integrity of the environment. So let's look at this little chart here. It's a very nice summary of how we can use the Sustainable Development Goals in order to guide, how should I put it, in order to guide the maintenance of our soil stability. Now, if you see here, when you look at this chart, you will actually see that we have many, let's see, we have a total of 8 of our 17 Sustainable Development Goals highlighted here in relation to soils. And that is because there is no one Sustainable Development Goal that addresses soils. But when you look at several of the Sustainable Development Goals, you see that there are aspects of the Sustainable Development Goal that relate directly to soils. Okay, so you see SDG 15, life on land, refers to habitats and biodiversity. Then there is SDG 13, related to climate action, talks about the important place of carbon cycling and carbon storage. So related to soils, we know that the nutrient cycle process, this is important here. SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, renewable materials, addresses renewable materials, sustainable production of the land, etc. I'm not going to go through all. And then on the next slide, we would look at a few of these as well in a little more detail. All right. So I would recommend that you all take some time to look at and study this chart in a little more detail. So here we continue. So what I did was I pulled out just a few of those SDGs on the previous slide. And if you recall, by now you should understand the structure and use of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So we have the goals, we have indicators, and then what I've done here is I've given you some, we have goals, targets, and then indicators. So what I have represented on this left column, this is the goal. SDG 1 represents the goal of no poverty. The targets, there are many targets associated with a goal, but what I've done is I've isolated one target for you, all right, as is applicable to soils. So target 1.4, and an example of an indicator that can be used to meet this target 1.4 is to look at the proportion of your population that has secure land rights, land tenure rights. Now, what does this have to do with soils? And in particular, agriculture. So we want to look at it from the perspective of agriculture. We know that the availability of secure land tenure rights actually puts farmers in a position of security and advantage where they are now willing and able to invest more significantly in the development of their land and hopefully more responsible agricultural practices in order to ensure safe and responsible agricultural production. All right, so where farmers can now see they have ownership rights, they now have access to loans and grants, etc. All right, Secondly, SDG 2, zero hunger. So the target we're looking at is 2.4. Another example of an indicator, or in other words, what can you measure? You can look at the proportion of the agricultural area under sustainable agricultural production. So if you have data available for agricultural, area of agricultural land available for your nation, you need to be able to determine what proportion, what percentage of that agricultural land is under sustainable agricultural production, right? And SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. We have two of them, two targets listed here, 12.3 and 12.4. 12.3, we can apply the food loss index here to measure the amount of food waste. So remember, we're looking to minimize the amount of food that is being wasted. This will count towards food security, and again, also count towards responsible use of your soil. Because if you're not wasting food, it means that you're looking, you're not going to be abusing your use of the soils. 12.4, you can measure the portion of hazardous waste treated in your nation. All right. So the more hazardous waste over time that can be treated, you know that less of it is going to be getting into your soil. All right. So ideally, you want to be monitoring your progress with regards to these targets over time. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that the UN has actually specified a specific target that nations must hit. But what you are doing with this information is that you want to be able to see progress over time. So it's necessary to collect long-term data in order to be able to make that determination. That also means then that from the highest levels of government to your environmental managers, it means they must be involved in getting all sectors of the society to organize their own data collection so that data can be available. From the highest level, they will have to define policies and regulations to define what data must be collected so that it can annually be collected at the national level in order to give a national picture of what is really taking place. So let's talk briefly about water, clean water. And let us look at that in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we know fresh water is of good quality, and in sufficient quantities, it must be necessary for all aspects of life, right? People need water for food security, we need it for health and sanitation, and we also need it to reduce poverty. This, as the next point indicates, water is necessary for poverty reduction. There's no way that you can have poverty reduction without clean water. All right, people, lack of clean water affects our health, our food security, and in turn that affects our ability to actually work and produce. All right, so it is important for sustaining economic growth through agriculture, energy industry, energy generation, and also the health of our ecosystems. So good clean water is also important for our ecosystem because we don't want to have polluted water out in our ecosystems because we know what the eventual effect would be, degradation of the health of our environment. So with regards to clean water, we focus specifically on SDG 6. SDG 6 ensures availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And what does that include? It looks at 8 global targets that are universally applicable and aspirational. And each government must decide how to incorporate them into national plans, the national planning process. So again, from the highest level So that would include, do we need to make adjustments to laws? Do we need to make adjustments to national water policies? You need to develop regulations to guide the implementation of these laws and policies. And you may need to do it across various sectors. So as you should be able to understand by now, this is a massive job that really requires the participation of all sectors of society. All right. And of course, as mentioned before, you have to look at the realities of your nation. Some countries will have larger water supplies to manage than others. Some may actually have situations of water stress. Um, what capacities do they have? Do they have the technical knowledge and know-how to manage their water? What are the level? What are your national priorities with regards to development? So these are all things that must be taken into consideration in even in the national planning process. So here we have some examples of indicators from SDG 6. So for example, target 6.3, an example of indicators where an indicator, we look at the proportion of the wastewater that's produced, is what portion is treated, is safely treated. So wastewater treatment, that's what we're talking about. So from all your wastewater, what portion or percentage of it is treated. We also can look at the portions of water bodies with good ambient water quality. So again, you're talking about good and regular data collection here, because you cannot define all of these things without data collection. 6.4, what are the levels of water stress as a portion of your water resources? In other words, you want to look at what is the balance of demand in relation to your water resources, what you have available. So do you have a situation of water stress existing in your nation? That would also be an indicator you would want to look at. And then 6.5, you want to look at the degree of integrated water resource management that you have implemented. So in other words, what levels of conservation, what levels of wastewater treatment, etc. All the different parts and different aspects of integrated water. And this can be, again, as with many of the others, represented as a percentage. And you want to be looking at this over a period of time to see if you have improvement taking place. Let's look at air pollution now. So air pollution, this is not an environmental issue that is treated in isolation. We understand that when we talk about air pollution, pollution can happen at a particular location uh, from a point source or from area sources. And because of the nature of the pollution and maybe the characteristics of winds and wind currents in particular areas, you find that that pollution can now travel from one geographic area to another, and now the problem can become regional or global. So now the issue of air quality affects everything around us. Therefore, there is no one SDG that specifically addresses air pollution. For example, air can be related to industries, water, cities, climate, land, and all of these we can actually find associated with different SDGs. Similarly to when we were looking at soils. So we're going to look briefly at some of them. So the air pollution is highlighted in 3 different SDGs that are highlighted here. If we look at SDG 3 looks specifically at good health and well-being. One of the targets associated with SDG 3, 3.9.1, This goal here is to reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals in the air, water, and soil. All right, so this one here, for the purpose of our particular discussion at this moment, is related to air. SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, target 11.6. The goal is to reduce the adverse per capita environmental impact. So to reduce the environmental impact based on your population size, the impact of the air quality, and municipal and other waste. So again, zone in here on the air quality. SDG 12, Consumption and Protection, target 12.4, the goal to reduce the release of chemical and other waste into the air, so pollutant reduction, in order to minimize the adverse effects on human health and the environment. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a few examples of indicators or types of data that can be measured in order to be able to define what is happening in your country or in your environment with regards to those goals. So SDG 3 related to good health and well-being. We looked at the target already. An example of what you can measure, remember, health and well-being with regards to air pollution. You can look at mortality rates attributed to household and ambient air pollution. Okay, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Community. Okay, one of the things that you can look at, the annual mean levels of fine particulate matter in cities. So the average PM pollutants in cities as measured according to your the weighting of your population. So in other words, it should reflect the average concentrations of PM in your air in a city should be reflected in relation to the population size that is exposed. So it's not only over a specific geographic area, but you must also consider your population size. SDG 12, Consumption and Production. You can look at a measure of the portion of hazardous waste that is treated as it relates to the air. All right, you can remember waste can end up in the air, in your water, in your soils. But in this particular case, you would want to look at types of waste that can affect the quality of your air. And again, data is needed in order to establish whether you're moving in a positive direction or not. So we have some international conventions that are related to physical stability, soil, water, and air, as we've discussed so far. As it relates to soils, we already know that we have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Remember, we talked about that before, and the importance of biological diversity in any ecosystem as it relates to sustainable development in terms of being able to continue to provide food for us, maintain a healthy environment, etc. And as mentioned before, soil is very important, or a very important component of healthy biological diversity, because this is where all our food and the natural land cover and all of these things have its foundation. And then of course we know the ecological processes are a very complex one. So anytime you have a disruption in any one component, you will have a disruption in the entire cycle. Okay, so water related now, we have the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. So this is a water convention specifically. What does this convention do? It aims to protect and ensure that the quantity, quality and sustainable use of these transboundary water resources by facilitating and promoting cooperation between the different stakeholders. In this case, if we're talking transboundaries, we're talking about different nations, all right? So, for example, we're talking about like shared rivers. We know there's some parts of the world that rivers run through from one country to another, like there's the Nile River, there is the Amazon River, all right? So this would be a very important convention to resources like those. Then there are shared maritime boundaries where, um, for example, between Trinidad and Venezuela, we over the years we have often had some tension over those maritime boundaries, the shared resources. Because remember, we also have the marine resources, fishing resources, etc., which is why we often have these problems with fishermen between the two countries. All right. And then, of course, we also have issues of occasional oil spills when it crosses over from one part of the maritime boundary into another. What do we do about it? How does it affect the environment on the other side of, on both sides of that boundary? So this is a very important convention here as it relates to transboundary water resources. Air pollution, an example related to air pollution in an international convention. So here we have the UNECE convention. This is a long-range transboundary air pollution convention. All right, so just as we had transboundary water convention, we have a transboundary air pollution convention. So this one is an example of a regional convention. The focus here is, where's my, right, here we are. It's a pan-European economic integration bloc. So it's an economic bloc. It is all, so they are signatories to this convention. And it is the first internationally binding instrument, legally binding instrument, to deal with the problems of air pollution on a broad regional basis. So we know that Europe is a pretty large geographic area, and historically we know that there have been many examples of air pollution traveling from its source to across boundaries into other countries. So they have signed on to this in order to try to manage those problems. Then we are also familiar with the Paris Agreement on climate change. This one is a global agreement. We know it's legally binding, and the goal here of this agreement is to limit global warming through the restriction of emissions of greenhouse gases. Okay. So here we've had a very short and concise summary of the concept of physical stability, and we have looked at its these physical stabilities in the context of sustainable development. So I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson, and I now refer you to eClassroom for today's activity. Thank you.